There is a strange possibility that the iguana appearing on your screen right now is not the first one you've noticed this week. In fact, once people become aware of iguanas, many begin seeing them everywhere. On social media, in videos, in photos, in conversations they would normally ignore. At first, it feels like coincidence. But researchers who study attention and animal behavior know something interesting about the way the brain works. The things that become meaningful to us suddenly seem to appear more often, even when they were there all along. That changes everything. Because this video is not really about an iguana appearing on your page. It is about why your mind decided to notice it, and why these remarkable reptiles may reveal something unexpected about memory, attention, and the hidden connections we form with the natural world. Later in this video, you'll discover the surprising reason iguanas often become impossible to ignore once they enter someone's awareness. But more importantly, you'll discover why that experience says something deeply human about the way we search for familiarity and meaning.
Every story begins with attention. Before an iguana can become memorable, it must first be noticed. Most people never realize how easy it is to overlook wildlife. An iguana can spend hours resting on a branch, blending so perfectly into its surroundings that hundreds of people pass by without seeing it. Then, one person notices, and suddenly the animal seems obvious. Researchers have found that attention works in a similar way. Our brains constantly filter enormous amounts of information, deciding what deserves awareness and what can remain in the background. The moment something captures our interest, that filter changes. An iguana that would have gone unnoticed yesterday suddenly stands out today. A photo catches your eye. A video appears in your feed. A conversation mentions reptiles. And before long, you begin seeing a pattern. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, because the world itself may not have changed at all. Only your attention has. And attention is powerful. It determines what becomes part of your experience. What you are watching is not merely an iguana appearing on your screen. It is a reminder that every meaningful connection begins with a simple act of noticing.
Once something has been noticed, the next step is memory. And this is where the story becomes far more interesting. Most people assume that seeing an iguana once should make very little difference. After all, we encounter thousands of images and ideas every day. Most disappear almost immediately. Yet, certain things remain. Researchers studying memory have discovered that the brain gives special attention to information that feels unusual, emotionally relevant, or personally meaningful. When something meets those conditions, it becomes easier to remember. Iguanas often fit that description perfectly. They look ancient. They move with a strange confidence. They seem both familiar and mysterious at the same time. Because of that, the first iguana you notice rarely stays alone in your memory. It creates a reference point. And once that reference point exists, future encounters become easier to remember as well. That changes everything, because now your mind is no longer encountering an iguana for the first time. It is comparing every new sighting to a memory that already exists. Most people never realize how much of their reality is shaped by remembered patterns. The things we recall most easily often become the things we notice most often, and what began as a single encounter slowly becomes something larger. What you are watching is not simply memory at work. It is your mind quietly deciding that a particular piece of the world deserves to be remembered.
Memory creates familiarity. Recognition brings that familiarity back into the present. Imagine seeing an iguana in a video thumbnail. Without memory, it would be just another image among thousands. But because you have seen one before, something happens instantly. You recognize it. Researchers have found that recognition allows both humans and animals to process information more efficiently. Familiar patterns require less effort to understand than completely new ones. And once a pattern becomes familiar, it starts standing out from the background. Few people understand how powerful this process really is. The brain is constantly searching for things it already knows. Faces, places, voices, ideas, and yes, even animals. That is why an iguana can suddenly seem as though it is appearing everywhere. The animal itself has not become more common. Your ability to recognize it has become stronger. There is something quietly extraordinary about that.
because recognition changes the way we experience reality. The familiar feels closer than the unfamiliar. The recognized feels more important than the ignored. And over time, that feeling can create a surprising sense of connection. Perhaps that is why people often remember certain animals long after a brief encounter. Not because the animal did anything extraordinary, but because recognition transformed a moment into something meaningful. What you are watching is not merely an iguana appearing again. It is familiarity returning, reminding you that once something becomes part of your awareness, it rarely disappears completely.
Recognition makes an iguana familiar. Observation reveals why it keeps holding your attention. Most people think of iguanas as simple reptiles, spending their days basking in the sun. But researchers have discovered that iguanas are constantly monitoring the world around them. They watch for predators, they watch for rivals, they watch for opportunities. And perhaps most surprisingly, they spend much of their lives deciding what deserves their attention and what can safely be ignored. In that sense, they are not so different from us. Every day, your mind faces the same challenge. Thousands of images, thousands of ideas, thousands of distractions. Yet only a handful become important enough to remain. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, because attention is never random. What we observe repeatedly often reflects what matters to us, whether we realize it or not. And the more often you notice an iguana, the more your brain begins treating it as something worth paying attention to. That changes everything. Because now the iguana is no longer just another animal. It has become a recurring character in your awareness. What you are watching is not merely observation. It is the beginning of a relationship between attention and meaning.
Observation gathers information. Learning transforms that information into understanding. Researchers have found that iguanas, like many reptiles, are capable of learning from experience. They remember useful locations, adapt to changing conditions, and modify behavior when circumstances require it. The animal becomes better at navigating its world because previous experiences continue influencing future decisions. Humans do exactly the same thing. The more often you encounter something, the more you learn about it. At first, an iguana may seem unusual. Then you learn where it lives, how it behaves, what makes it different from other reptiles. Slowly, the unfamiliar becomes familiar. Few people understand how much learning changes perception. Once knowledge enters the picture, the world looks different. Things that were invisible suddenly become obvious. Patterns that once seemed random begin making sense. That is why the iguana keeps appearing. Not because it has changed, because you have. Your understanding has expanded, and expanded awareness reveals details that were always present. There is something quietly extraordinary about realizing that. The more we learn about the world the world seems to reveal itself. What you are watching is not simply a reptile becoming familiar. It is your own perception growing larger, one discovery at a time.
Learning creates familiarity. Familiarity often creates trust. Not the kind of trust shared between close friends, but a quieter form of trust that exists throughout nature. Researchers have observed that iguanas gradually become less reactive to predictable events in their environment. A repeated sound that never signals danger becomes easier to ignore. A familiar pathway becomes easier to use. A routine that consistently feels safe becomes part of daily life. The animal is not becoming careless. It is becoming confident. That changes everything, because confidence is built from experience. An iguana that has repeatedly encountered the same harmless pattern no longer needs to treat it as a threat. Humans work much the same way. We trust familiar roads, familiar routines, familiar places. The things we encounter repeatedly often become part of our comfort zone. Most people never realize how much of life depends on this process. Trust is rarely created in a single moment. It grows through repetition, through consistency, through evidence. And perhaps that is why the iguana keeps appearing on your page. The more familiar it becomes, the more naturally your attention returns to it. What you are watching is not simply an animal adapting to its environment. It is a reminder that familiarity often becomes the foundation of trust.
At first glance, iguanas seem silent. Unlike birds, they do not fill the air with songs. Unlike mammals, they do not constantly call to one another.
Yet researchers have discovered that iguanas communicate in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Body posture, head movements, territorial displays, subtle visual signals. An iguana can share information without making a sound. Few people understand how remarkable that really is, because communication is not limited to words. It is the ability to leave information behind that influences another life. And in that sense, communication happens everywhere. A gesture, a glance, a memory, a photograph, even a video appearing on your screen. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, because the iguana you keep seeing online is communicating something, even unintentionally. Not a message from the animal itself, a message from your own attention. A reminder of what your mind has decided is worth noticing. That changes everything, because the more frequently something appears in your awareness, the more it begins participating in your internal conversation. And once that happens, it becomes difficult to ignore. What you are watching is not simply a reptile appearing on your page. It is an idea communicating with your attention, one encounter at a time.
And ultimately, everything leads here. The noticing, the remembering, the recognizing, the observing, the learning, the trusting, the communicating. All of it shapes one final act: choosing. Most people assume that the iguana keeps appearing because an algorithm decided to show it. And sometimes that is true, but algorithms alone cannot explain why certain images stop us, why certain animals stay with us, or why some encounters feel strangely meaningful while thousands of others are forgotten. Researchers who study attention have found that the human brain is constantly making choices about what deserves awareness. Every day, countless pieces of information pass through your life. Most disappear, a few remain. And once something remains long enough, it begins influencing future choices. You click, you notice, you remember. The cycle continues. That changes everything, because the real question is not why the iguana keeps appearing. The real question is why your mind keeps choosing to notice it. Perhaps it is because iguanas represent something rare in the modern world: patience, stillness, adaptation, a life connected to rhythms much older than our own. Or perhaps the answer is even simpler. Perhaps your attention recognized something familiar long before you consciously understood it. There is something quietly extraordinary about realizing that. The animals that capture our attention often reveal something about ourselves, not because they are magical, not because they are sending messages, but because attention is personal, and what we repeatedly choose to notice becomes part of who we are. Few people understand how deeply this connects to the human experience. We all want to be recognized. We all want to belong. We all search for patterns that help us make sense of the world. And sometimes, in the most unexpected ways, a wild animal becomes part of that search. The iguana appearing on your page is not really the story. The story is what happened inside your awareness when you decided to stop and look. What you are watching is not simply an animal. It is a reminder that meaning often begins when attention chooses to stay.
So, the next time an iguana appears on your page, take a moment before scrolling past. Ask yourself why it caught your attention. What made you stop? What made you look twice? And I'd love to hear your story. Has there ever been a wild animal that seemed to follow you through life? Not literally, but through repeated encounters, memories, or moments that felt strangely connected? Tell us what happened in the comments. Sometimes the most meaningful wildlife experiences are not the dramatic ones. Sometimes they begin with a simple moment of noticing. And sometimes that moment stays with us far longer than we expect. Thank you for watching. And wherever you are, keep paying attention. You never know what part of the natural world might already be quietly becoming familiar.